Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace to all of you. Welcome to this, our special web event by the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community USA. Good afternoon to most of you who are here in America. Good evening to some of you who are in Europe and other parts of the world. Thank you so much for joining. We're really delighted to be convening this web event in circumstances that, of course, are very trying and dire. All of us are quarantined in various environments all over the world. And these are really solemn times. And I really appreciate taking an hour out of your day to be here virtually. We wish we can do this in person. But I think the issues we're covering this afternoon are quite important and timely, and we hope you benefit from it. I also wanted just to set some ground rules. This is a Zoom platform, so the way we're going to function is we're going to disable everyone's audio except for the panelists, and so that way we have a clear audio feed for all of our esteemed panelists when they speak. We're going to have prepared remarks from the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to a question and answer session. And for that, we encourage people to post questions on the chat. We'll be monitoring that. You can also raise your hand using the raise your hand feature. If you click participants down below, you'll see participants. You could raise your hand and we'll be able to see you and call on you for any questions as well. And then we'll unmute your audio and you can state your name and affiliation. That way we'll have a very easy flow. And we're hoping to have hopefully 20 or more minutes for question and answer. And we'll try to end as close as we can to the hour mark. As I was thinking about this afternoon and how to frame this event, it occurred to me that all of us are so preoccupied with our family life and the well-being of our loved ones, yet there are so many vulnerable communities who were suffering prior to this pandemic and tragically are suffering even with greater intensity during the pandemic. And this is something that if you look globally, you have over 70 million forcibly displaced persons. A good number of them are religious minorities. That's a staggering number, the highest it's ever been. But during this pandemic, what we've seen is almost like a proverbial tornado on top of a blazing inferno for these communities, because they were already suffering and beleaguered, and then you have COVID and the virus complicating matters intensely. And so I was reading through, as all of us have been, trying to make sense of this. And as I was reading about so many different communities being affected, it occurred to me that I would maybe just kind of put those together in a form where you can see these are just a few of the headlines that I just put together. It's really quite remarkable. I mean, you're looking at Muslims in India who have been suffering, communities that are being labeled as worse than the virus itself. A remarkable situation. We see the COVID restrictions inflaming religious tensions. These are actual headlines. There's some headlines that even predate some weeks ago of communities that are suffering, Ahmadis who are suffering in Pakistan, elsewhere, Hindus and Christians. If you continue this picture, you'll see that there was a terrible terrorist attack in the midst of this pandemic early on in Kabul, and there were many Sikhs that were killed in that attack.
I'm hearing Amjad.
And if you look at the situation of religious minorities in Pakistan, Christians, Hindus, Ahmadis, incredible, staggering situation there. The Rohingya community, which has been really one of the most persecuted communities globally, all over the world, there's such great hostility that they're facing in Malaysia, obviously in Myanmar, and also the complicated situation in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. And we'll be talking about that a bit later. The Uyghurs in China, obviously one of the largest mass detentions in recent memory. And now they're in the midst of Ramadan and there's forced labor accounts of forced labor and so forth. So these are just a few of the smattering of headlines. Christians are vulnerable all over the world. We see this in Mexico, in Nigeria, in Iran, Sri Lanka. Again, these are actual headlines just in the last few weeks. So I just thought I would frame these opening remarks just to set forth that these are really acute times. Our first speaker this afternoon is the Honorable Sam Brownback. He is the United States Ambassador for International Religious Freedom, nominated by President Trump. He was sworn in for this position in February of 2018. And the situation at the time, of course, international religious freedom has been a hotbed issue. But in these past 2 years, Ambassador Brownback has really taken the reins and done a lot of traveling and meeting so many communities. Prior to this, as many of you know, he was governor of Kansas from 2011 to 2018. And then prior to that, had a very distinguished career in the Senate. So he has spent many years dealing with policy and advocacy. And I have to say that the International Religious Freedom Act, which was passed in 1998, he was one of the key sponsors of that legislation, which actually helped enable the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I remember that year, Ambassador, very well. That was the first, I was in college, and that was a year where I was, beginning my advocacy as a younger student. And I remember your remarks and your work, and that has had meaningful impact. And we'll talk about you, sir, in a few minutes as well. So the virtual floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you. And you also aged me by saying you were in college when that took place. I was up at the UN last year, and the guy that was taking care of our table wanted to meet me. And I said, happy to talk with you. And he said, yeah, I've never met a vintage US politician before. And so I thought, vintage, that's what I am. Okay, well, that's better than other names I could think of. But unfortunately, this topic's one I've been around a long time, and I wish it was trending in the right direction, but it's been trending in the wrong direction. And your headlines speak to a lot of it. I'll get really right to the point on this. At first, I do want to thank Amjad. I want to thank the Ahmadi community for hosting this. It's very timely and very important. Some of you may know the president of the Ahmadi community in the United States is a physician in my home state of Kansas, and is in one of our hotbed places for the outbreak of the crisis in Dodge City, where there's a packing facility, and those have been hit hard. And so our thoughts and prayers go out to anybody and everybody that's been touched by this virus. And it's been very, very difficult and continues to be. Then it gets compounded if you're a religious minority, is the problem with it. There is one good side, and I want to hit that first. And the good side of this has been we've seen more prisoners of conscience or religious prisoners released during this COVID crisis than any time that I've been in the office. So we've had a number released in various places. Burma has released a number of Rohingya refugees. Iran has released 100,000 prisoners. Now, a number of the prisoners of conscience they didn't release, but they did release some. We've seen Cuba release one, some, few here and there, different places, but kind of anybody that we can get out of jail that's there because of their peaceful practice of their faith, we consider that a win, and we're happy to see that happening. And we've tried really to use this COVID crisis to say, you don't want to expose these people who are peaceful adherents of their faith to a dangerous situation for them health-wise in a crowded, unsanitary prison cell. They need to be released. They should be released. And we have an alliance of nations that work on religious freedom, and we all push together on this topic, and a number did get released. On the bad side of the equation, what you're seeing is also, unfortunately, on top of the COVID crisis, you're seeing sometimes religious minorities get scapegoated and get said, okay, they're the reason that we're having this in our country, which is not true. They're the ones that are spreading it. They're super spreaders, which again is not true. So you're seeing a scapegoating taking place in places. And then you're also seeing places, religious minorities often don't have an equal citizenship of other people. So that equal citizenship then gets expressed in they don't get access to health care, or there's food aid that comes into the country and it only goes to the religious majority, not to the religious minority community. Or sometimes they have some of the lowest jobs in the society, and then they're not getting protective equipment to be able to do that. Sanitation workers in Pakistan are often a Christian community, and they're not getting the sanitation, they're not getting the protective equipment that they need to be able to do their job. And so they're more vulnerable and more exposed. What I think is key for us to do now is, in this heart of this crisis, is to express these things in the global community within the context of what the world is focused on right now, which is the COVID crisis, which we should be focused on. But we need to then make the story about, okay, these religious minorities should not be treated this way. They shouldn't be treated this way in normal times. They shouldn't be treated this way in these sort of extraordinary, very difficult times that we're in. And I think we need to really put a light on that. That's why I think it's very, very good and positive of what you're doing, hosting this event. The Ahmadi community has been great about raising the awareness of what's happening to Ahmadis, but not just to the Ahmadis, because what happens to one religious minority happens to all of them. And it's only really by us coming together and standing for each other's religious freedom and rights as equal citizens, regardless of what we believe, that we can really push this agenda forward. And so I applaud this effort, and we really need to spread this word about the people, regardless of their religious beliefs, need to have equal access, equal treatment, and be able to get the health care that they need in this crisis.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brownback. I really applaud your efforts. I do want to say here that for us advocates, and I have a legal practice here in Los Angeles and come to DC a lot. One of the most remarkable things that I've seen in the past 2 years under Ambassador Brownback's leadership is the weekly roundtable meetings. So these are, the International Religious Freedom Community has a roundtable, and this roundtable has been in existence for a number of years of representatives from all faith communities, people of no faith, people who are just concerned about international religious freedom. And what Ambassador Brownback has done immediately when he took this office is that he meets with the roundtable weekly, most weeks. And also there were 2 ministerials for religious freedom. The first of its kind was held a few years ago, one again last year, and this year, God willing, it will be in Poland. And I think this effort is global. It's an international alliance. And what we're seeing is stakeholders, when they come together, it becomes extraordinary. And so I just wanted to mention that, Ambassador. Thank you so much for those remarks.
Thank you.
I wanted to now turn to United States Congresswoman Jackie Speier. We're very delighted. I know her schedule is very busy during this time. She's a Congresswoman from California's 14th district. She sits on several committees. She sits on the House Armed Services Committee, the House Select Committee on Intelligence, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. She's also the co-chair of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Congressional Caucus, it's a bipartisan caucus of about 40 members of Congress, and it was founded in 2014. Congresswoman Speier, thank you so much for joining. I hope you can hear us okay.
I can, Amjad, and thank you so much for the opportunity to join you. As you can tell, I'm outside. I'm actually at a food distribution center here in my district, where over 1,000, right there, Brownback, how grateful I am for his leadership. I think it's a great example of bipartisanship in the Congress, where oftentimes there is not much. To have Republicans and Democrats join together, voicing the persecution of religious minorities around the world. So I just want to say, during this Ahmadiyya Day of Advocacy on the Hill, once again, the community has stepped up, and you do it so effectively in so many ways, thinking not just of the community of Ahmadiyya Muslims, but of persecuted religious minorities around the world. And as you pointed out, Jad, that 70 million people, it's hard to even get your arms around the number of those being persecuted. And they get persecuted during times of peace and prosperity, but it gets exacerbated, obviously, during times of turmoil where there's less water, less food, and the opportunity for some to engage in xenophobia. That's obviously the case here in California and in many places around the country where Chinese Americans, Asian Americans are all scared, frankly, and oftentimes are spat upon and talked down to, hate us back and observing. So I just want to say, I know you're going to talk about Cox's Bazar later, but it's interesting to point out that the density there is 1.5 times greater than it is in New York City. So imagine the potential for COVID-19 to spread throughout that particular refugee camp. It's important for us as we spend time looking inward because the COVID crisis has hit the United States so badly that we also extend our hands and look outward, much like the generosity we're seeing right here in terms of people volunteering to distribute food, and that's going on across this country. So I just want to applaud you all. Again, I'm proud to be a member of this esteemed group and proud to co-chair the Ahmadiyya Muslim Caucus. And I want to again thank Ambassador Brownback and Commissioner Reverend Brown, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Malik, who are participating in the panel as well. Godspeed to all of you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Speier. I know you're in the field, and I really appreciate you joining. We were able to get most of that. I know this is a difficult time, and thank you for all the service you're doing in terms of helping those in need here domestically, and your leadership really on religious freedom. It's been unwavering for almost a decade that I've known you, and it really means a lot, and it helps the communities directly as well. So I want to take this opportunity to welcome members of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. This is a nonpartisan independent body created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which I mentioned, and this body's work is incredibly important. And this event is rather timely because there's just a few days ago, USERF, which is the shorthand that we use for this body, released their annual report. And we're very delighted to have the Vice Chair, Gail Manchin, here on this call. And today we'll be hearing from Commissioner Johnnie Moore. Johnnie Moore was appointed to the US Commission on International Religious Freedom by President Trump. And he, a very dear friend, I've gotten to know him for the past several years. He has his own consultancy company, the Kairos Company. He's the president of the Congress of Christian Leaders. And more than anything, he's probably he travels more than anyone I know. And he's, in the past several years, in this capacity, has really met so many different communities all over the world, particularly in the Muslim world as well. And we really are delighted to have him here. And Reverend Moore, if you could share your remarks.
Thank you, Amjad. And I have to say, it is not an enviable task to follow Ambassador Brownback and Representative Speier. This is a real privilege, and it's an honor to have Vice Chair Manchin listening in as well. I think the whole lot of people here talking to this subject demonstrates the unique and amazing moment we're living in, where religious freedom is not on the peripheral of foreign policy in the United States and on the attention of the globe more broadly speaking. It's at the very heart of it. And Ambassador Brownback is, continuing an amazing legacy of his predecessors, all of which did extraordinary things. But he is now, responsible for what is the most significant government effort to promote religious freedom in history. And that's one of the many highlights in our report this year, the many ways in which religious freedom is making new strides, and it's making a difference. I thought I'd just summarize the report a bit and then make a few comments about Pakistan. The report's about 100 pages. It is the annual report. It's the only report that Congress mandates that we produce. But you should know this is our 20th report this year. It's not our first report. It is our 20th publication. And every year, by May 1st, it is our responsibility to identify around the world the countries that are the worst violators of religious freedom, or countries that we need to pay attention to for related issues. This year, there are 29 countries in our report. Our observations are entirely on the basis of 2019. We don't look at 2018 or what's already happened. This year, we're informed about those things, but we're required to make a decision based upon what happened over the last year. We divide the countries in two categories. So there's CPCs, countries of particular concern. In order to become a CPC, you have to be responsible for infractions that meet criteria. They have to be ongoing, systematic, and egregious. That's the criteria. If a country meets all three of those criteria, then our commission of 9 commissioners appointed by Democrats and Republicans, we take a vote, and it's on the basis of a majority vote. In a country, many of those votes are unanimous, and a country ends up on the CPC list. This year, there's a change in criteria for our second level. We used to call it Tier 2. This year, it's called the Special Watch List, akin to what the State Department does. They have CPCs and a Special Watch List. In order to be on our Special Watch List, you have to meet 2 of the criteria, right? So there has to be ongoing and systematic, or systematic and egregious. Only 2 of the 3 you get on the special watch list. So this year there are 14 countries on our CPC list. This includes 9 countries that the State Department also has on their CPC list, and then we added an additional 5. A country like Nigeria, for instance. We have a differing point of view with the State Department on Nigeria. Part of our responsibility as a commission is to be entirely independent, right? So we're an independent watchdog created by Congress. The State Department has a different mandate. It's not for me to speak to, it's for the ambassador to speak to. But one of the observations we make as a commission is we cannot take into account any foreign policy priorities or observations about the United States government. We have to just look at one issue, which is religious freedom, totally disregard all the other mitigating factors, and make a decision based upon this single factor. So that's why sometimes you'll see that we have more countries on our list than the State Department has on theirs. This is also a good opportunity to say what differentiates us from what the State Department does every year is we also make specific policy recommendations. So in our report, in every chapter of every country, you're going to find specific recommendations where we say, in order to improve the situation, we recommend the United States government could do things like X, Y, and Z. And our special watch list this year includes 4 countries the State Department also deemed on their special watch list, countries like Cuba and Nicaragua, Sudan and Uzbekistan. But then we have an additional 11 countries which we put on our special watch list. Countries like Indonesia, Turkey, Afghanistan, countries like that. Also in the report, though, we give credit where credit is due. And so in our individual chapters, if a government does something positive, we'll say it. We're not just about criticizing what's bad. We'll tell if there's progress in any direction, we'll give them credit for it. And sometimes that progress is significant enough that the commissioners will vote on a majority basis that a country should be moved. And this happened several times this year. In the positive fronts, you have the Sudan. And the Sudan has for 20 years been a CPC. It's been one of the worst violators of religious freedom of any country in the world. And because of incredible engagement by the State Department, incredible engagement by USCIRF, meetings that we've all had with the interim government. You know, we're now a year after the transition in the country, after the end of the horrific reign of Omar al-Bashir. And we determined that while there's plenty of work left to be done, you know, the Sudan has remarkably moved from a CPC to our special watch list, something that was unimaginable only a couple of years ago. But we didn't make the decision on the basis of feelings, right? We made it on the basis of a visit there, of sitting down with government officials, including the interim prime minister, the minister of education, minister of Islamic affairs. And one of the things that we specify in the report is the Sudan has already made significant changes in their laws. You know, they have already repealed their public order law, which was an incredibly oppressive law. We've sat down with other religious communities across the country, and it's clear things have changed. We also give Uzbekistan credit. The State Department did that last year. This year, we have also moved them to an improved state on our list. In the interest of time, I'll just emphasize a few other things and be quiet. The report also does a couple of other things. We, for instance, identify entities of particular concern as well, as does the State Department. This year, there's 6 of those entities of particular concern. They're entities that will not surprise anyone, entities like Al-Shabaab in Somalia and Boko Haram in Nigeria, the Houthis in Yemen, the 2 groups in Afghanistan, the Islamic State of the Khorasan province, the Taliban is still on our list. And then this year we added a list. We added a group in Syria called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They're also on our list this year. One other interesting thing in the report that I call everyone's attention to as well is, you know, we've struggled for a long time with our fixation on individual countries has meant that we've often missed trends around the world. So this year we have a whole additional chapter called Key Developments. And in that chapter, we identify other trends around the world that may involve countries that aren't on our list. For instance, anti-Semitism in Europe. There's no country on our list for anti-Semitism in Europe, but there's a whole section in our report on a stunning rise in anti-Semitism in Western democracies and Europe. We also cite China's exportation of their intolerance to other countries of the world, their manipulation of the international system, the tax on house of worship, blasphemy laws, which I'm so sorry to say that if any community in the world is aware of blasphemy laws, it's the Ahmadi community, because you, as a community, are probably subject to the worst forms of blasphemy laws on a greater degree than any community in the world. Which lends me to my last point, which is Pakistan. You know, this is a country that has the capability of changing, and yet they still, one more time, are a CPC on USCIRF's list for some very, very specific reasons. Reasons that they are capable of solving, and yet they've still chosen not to solve those issues, chief of which are the blasphemy laws, and chief of which are what they do to your community. And you know, I'm preaching to the choir, but for the sake of everyone else, you know, that may be listening to this, the way the Ahmadi community is criminalized, the way they're treated unjustly, and not just by the judicial and other legal authorities in the country, but in the way the memory of the Ahmadi community and its, we would not have a modern Pakistan. We would not have a Pakistani country if it wasn't for the contribution of Ahmadis. And yet they're among the most reviled community in the country, and it is reprehensible, and we call it out again and again and again, and we have been calling it out again and again and again in our report. But again, it's not enough to call these things out. We cite specific recommendations in order to improve the situation. And one of the recommendations in our report to the US government is this amazing part of the IRFA legislation that's been rarely used, but it has been used and used by the Trump administrations, by the way, in recent years with certain countries. But one of the things that can be done in the IRFA legislation is you can facilitate a binding agreement between the United States and another country in order to address religious freedom. And so I'll just be very specific. In our report, we're suggesting that the United States government forms a binding agreement with the Pakistani government that would move the religious freedom agenda forward. Some of those things that could be included in that agreement could be releasing prisoners who are incarcerated because of blasphemy, other people who are simply incarcerated because of their religious beliefs. Repeal blasphemy laws, but that might take some time. So in the meantime, there are plenty of things that can be done to lessen the impact of them. Blasphemy could be a bailable offense. The certain aspects of the penal code in Pakistan that could be used, like it's a crime to make a false accusation against someone, but it's never used when someone makes a false accusation against someone in the Ahmadiyya community. There could be things done to address extremist rhetoric. A national commission could be created addressing minority rights. There are all kinds of things to be done. I should say, I believe they can be done because it hasn't just been a bad year in Pakistan. Good things have happened in Pakistan. You know, with the Sikh community, the Pakistani government opened a new university, you know, for the Sikh community. A new Hindu temple was built in the country. The Asia Bibi, you know, her horrible situation. Asia Bibi is no longer in the situation she was in Pakistan. We all celebrated Abdul Shakur, who I was one of the great moments of my entire life was meeting Abdul Shakur in the United States after being an advocate for his release. The government of Pakistan has said that they're going to pay attention to the curriculum in madrasas. You know, they've said that before, but they've set a deadline for 2021, right? So there's signals that are being issued, and those signals need to be encouraged because the Ahmadiyya community and certain Christians and Hindus and others in the country, and certain Muslims who stand up in defense of other Muslims in the country, these things have to stop. They can be stopped, and hopefully USCIRF can make a difference with Pakistan, as we did with Sudan, and as we're trying to do with so many other countries around the world.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Moore. You have done so much tremendous work. USCIRF has done so much tremendous work. And please know that the reports that you publish actually are directly used. I've already started to use it in advocacy work. You know, when we do asylum proceedings or we work on refugee cases, frequently we appear as expert witnesses. We have to draw on USCIRF submissions. I think I may have submitted USCIRF reports in maybe 20 or 30 cases in my career. And that, I think, is a tremendous service because you are monitoring areas and communities that may not necessarily be represented all the time. And I think that's very important. And thank you, Commissioner Manchin, for joining and for your leadership on this issue. I also wanted to thank all of the other commissioners, many of whom we've gotten to know very well. We had a USCIRF delegation visit the convention of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and met His Holiness and presented their findings and reports. It was a very terrific effort. I now want to turn quickly to two advocates who are working on the ground, and they're working in various capacities. One in particular, to begin with, is Matthew Smith. I've gotten to know Matthew Smith online. He's one of those Twitter accounts you just need to follow. Fortify Rights is an amazing organization. I've gotten to know their work just virtually. And they are an organization that's really razor sharp focused on Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Malaysia, Thailand. Our next speaker, Matt Smith, actually is based in Bangkok and spends a lot of time there. He has a terrific background. He was with Human Rights Watch, Earth Rights. He was a fellow at the Carr Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. A terrific advocate. Fortify Rights documents mass atrocities, genocide. And I wanted, Matt, there's so much I can ask you, but for purposes of your remarks, if you could talk a bit about the plight of the Rohingya community, that would be, and of course we'll have questions and answers later, but I wanted to begin with that. Matthew?
Thank you so much, Amjad. Thank you for that generous introduction. And thank you to the Ahmadiyya community for this kind invitation. I'm very happy and honored to be here. Thanks to all my fellow panelists. Definitely looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you also, Ambassador Brownback, for all you've done for religious freedom, and I'd say particularly for your leadership on behalf of the Rohingya community. So yeah, I can share a bit about our work with the Rohingya. You'll sometimes hear the community referred to as Rohingya, both pronunciations the community uses. And we have been working closely with Rohingya communities in Myanmar, Bangladesh, Thailand, Malaysia. And just to emphasize that in all of these places, there are enormous numbers of local human rights defenders that are ready and able to make a difference. And many of them need and want support. And that's actually precisely why we founded Fortify Rights in 2013. So we're doing, our theory of change really revolves around three core strategies. We're doing investigations, we're engaging people with power on solutions. And the third part is we're working to strengthen community-based responses to human rights violations. And we're doing that not only actually with the Rohingya, but also with other religious minority communities, including Kachin Christians in northern Myanmar who are also facing war crimes as we speak. But for those not familiar with the Rohingya, they're an ethnic and religious minority that is indigenous to Western Myanmar. Myanmar has long denied their existence as well as their citizenship and continues to impose brutal restrictions on their everyday lives. Just to fast forward a bit, in 2016 and 2017, ostensibly in response to a small, ill-equipped Rohingya armed group killing first 9 and then 12 Myanmar officials, Myanmar authorities attacked Rohingya civilians en masse. The authorities deployed more than 11,000 soldiers. They razed more than 400 Rohingya villages in 3 townships in Rakhine State. And we documented how soldiers threw infants into fires, massacred and raped men, women, and children, forced more than 800,000 Rohingya into neighboring Bangladesh. And at the time, this was the fastest refugee outflow since the Rwandan genocide. We released a report in 2018 presenting evidence and legal analysis of the crime of genocide. 2 months later, a UN fact-finding mission similarly issued what was in effect a genocide determination. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum issued a similar determination. And what I think was a breakthrough moment for Rohingya last year, the Gambia filed a lawsuit against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice alleging genocide. And the Office of the Prosecutor at the ICC also opened an investigation into those 2017 attacks. Nevertheless, attacks do continue, and certainly COVID has not helped. I was on a call the other day with my colleague Tams Liu, and she very accurately said COVID-19 has stopped everything but human rights violations. That's particularly true for the Rohingya. There are more than 1 million Rohingya refugees that are presently confined to squalid internment refugee camps in Bangladesh. There are more than 125,000 confined to upwards of 20 internment camps in 5 townships in Myanmar and Rakhine State. There are more than 500,000 to 600,000 who are effectively confined to their villages. Many of them are running out of basic provisions right now, and the government is denying access to aid workers. All of these communities are at grave risk of a COVID outbreak. Thankfully, there's not been an outbreak yet, but the Rohingya, among others, are certainly suffering. I want to mention just briefly the issue of human trafficking. For years, transnational trafficking syndicates have preyed on tens of thousands of Rohingya. They've subjected them to brutal trafficking, luring them onto ships at sea with hopes of a better life in Malaysia. Once at sea, they're treated essentially as disposable property. Traffickers are murdering, beating, starving Rohingya, demanding exorbitant payments, or in some cases, selling their human cargo to the highest bidder. As we speak right now, several of these ships are actually stranded out at sea in the Indian Ocean, and governments in the region are not allowing them to make landfall. So these ships have, we're not certain, but have between 500 and 1,000 lives on board. Malaysia and Bangladesh have each pushed boats back out to sea in recent weeks. Malaysia, for its part, is citing COVID-19 and a very dangerous, as Amjad mentioned in his introductory remarks, a very dangerous and widespread anti-Rohingya campaign of hate has emerged in Malaysia, putting essentially all Rohingya who are there, refugees who are there, putting them at risk of violence and additional abuse. The community's frightened, understandably, they're scared, they're facing threats in a place where they essentially have no rights. And unfortunately, I regret to say the government has done very little to counter the campaign, and in recent remarks has actually exacerbated it. The policies to push Rohingya boats back out to sea is not only unlawful, it's obviously incredibly callous and inhumane. One ship was rescued on April 15th, and we know at least 60 people were killed or otherwise died while on board. Crew members beat passengers with metal rods, in some cases to death. We published new information about this today, actually. So with these and other ships adrift at sea in the Indian Ocean, without a doubt, I would say that every day that passes now, more lives are lost. We went through a similar situation in 2015 when there were enormous numbers of Rohingya stranded at sea, governments not allowing them to make landfall or disembark. And then with effective pressure by the US government and others, certain governments, including Malaysia, changed their policy and allowed some of these ships to disembark. So right now we're advocating for Bangladesh, Malaysia, and other ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia to deploy search and rescue missions and to allow Rohingya to safely disembark. Very happy to continue the conversation about what's happening to the Rohingya. And once again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you all today.
Thank you, Matthew. I really appreciate it. I encourage everyone to read the reports and to follow the Twitter handle. So the information that's coming out of that region is just alarming. The Ahmadiyya Muslim community continues to be extremely alarmed by the Rohingya plight. And this is something that the community has done advocacy days around, because it working with Rohingyas in America as well. I want to commend the work of Ambassador Brownback. He's actually been to Cox's Bazar and spent time there. And in fact, Ambassador, if you take a minute here to maybe share that experience, since it's pertinent on the heels of Matthew's remarks.
It's a horrible situation. I mean, when you were describing this, I was just sending a note in to try to see if there's some way that we can be more helpful with some of these refugees that are on the boats. But the Cox's Bazar situation is just, one, it's very crowded. Their sanitation is the rudimentary at best. It's one that you get a COVID virus spreading in that atmosphere and in that environment, and it will go crazy. Concentration, the population density is huge. It's just got all the factors that would be horrible for the Rohingya in that situation. Or for anybody that would get in that situation. This is also really one of the times that I hope people that are watching and listening to this will advocate with the governments on a basis, a humanitarian basis, to be able to take them in and be able to deal with this. This is one of the worst current situations in the world. There are a lot of situations that have been going on for long period of time and they need to be resolved, but this one is just it's a live one, it's a current one, it's an ongoing one, and now really is a moment we need to push back more aggressively to tell people just how horrible this is for these people, and let the boats land.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, I remember reading your note after your trip, which was really moving to me personally. And for anyone who's visiting this region, it is just heart-wrenching to see the images and the story you just shared, Matthew, about 1,000 being on active boats right now really is something that is hard to wrap your mind around. Our final advocate here, and we'll open it up, is Qudus Malik. He is the Executive Director of Global Lawyers for Refugees. Qudus has a really distinguished legal career. He received his JD from Columbia, his human rights additional LLM from Georgetown, and has advocated all over the world for prisoners of conscience in the Middle East, South Asia. And Qudus has been working in the space of providing legal advocacy for refugees. And the reason why that is, I think, a very important consideration here is because their live cases even during this COVID. And I wanted to give Qudus a few minutes here, just an opportunity. Qudus, you've been working on religious refugee cases, I know, for years, but what challenges does COVID-19 particularly pose to these cases? And during this time, what steps do you think should be, what are these special challenges, and what steps have you taken and your team have taken?
Thank you, Amjad. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace to everybody. It is an honor to be a part of this distinguished panel. I also wanted to take this opportunity to wish everyone on this call a happy Ramadan. Ramadan, as you know, is the 9th month of the Muslim calendar. It's the month of fasting. And the Muslim calendar began its count from 622 AD, the year when the severely persecuted early Muslims, after suffering 13 years of serious persecution, had to flee from the city of Mecca and were forced to find refuge in Medina. And this included the founder of Islam, the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So Islam grew out of religious persecution of the worst kind, and it is why we find one of the most beautiful and eloquent expressions of religious freedom in the Holy Quran. It says, there is no compulsion in religion. And this one verse guides all refugee and migration law today. And when the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was leaving Mecca, the enemy was in hot pursuit. He looked back one last time and said, "O city of Mecca, you are dearer to me than all the places of the world, but your inhabitants do not allow me to live here anymore." He captured the sentiments of the millions of refugees today who have been forced to flee their homeland due to religious persecution and are now languishing in foreign countries, waiting to find out what the future holds. It certainly captures the sentiments and pain of all Pakistani Ahmadis who can no longer live in their beloved country because of a small minority of those who misuse the teachings of Islam. I've met thousands of asylum seekers and refugees from all over the world over the last many years. And I can tell you that the one thing that is unbearable for them is the uncertainty they constantly face and must endure. Will I survive or will I be killed? Will I get the right travel documents to help me flee? Will I successfully be able to enter the country I'm fleeing to? Would I be arrested by the immigration authorities? How long would I stay in immigration detention? Would I be able to allow to post bail? What would happen to my children if I get arrested? Will they be able to get an education? Would I win my asylum case? And the list goes on. There's so much uncertainty surrounding this process. Asylum seekers and refugees face it on a daily basis. And now let's throw this pandemic into the mix. And it's a miracle and a triumph of the human spirit that they keep going. Countries have shut down their borders. The legal systems are not able to process their claims. There are fissures in the legal process. The legal process is crippled due to COVID, and it's making advocacy very difficult. The experts are not able to provide crucial expert testimony. We can't get witnesses who can testify, which will make the difference between winning or losing an asylum claim. Everything is taking longer. People are not responsive. There are no resources. Coronavirus has been a game changer of the worst kind for millions of asylum seekers and refugees all over the world. Their lives, already insignificant in the eyes of many politicians and big governments, have become even more unnecessary. Public health concerns are being pitted against the right to asylum. It's a false choice, but many countries are unfortunately using COVID to pursue anti-refugee policies. People who are on the ground, who are suffering, they're afraid of being arrested by the immigration authorities. I have a Christian client in Thailand. I spoke to them a couple of days ago. They were praying in their room, praying to God to help them save and survive Corona when the immigration authorities started to bang on their doors and they were trying to break in, and they for 5 or 7 minutes, they basically hid in a bathroom, worried that if their kids make a sound, the immigration authorities will nab them and take them to the Bangkok Immigration Detention Center that is notoriously overpopulated. And if COVID gets there, it is, you know, he was saying to me that I brought these kids from Pakistan to Thailand, and I used to hold their hands and walk around and go outside. Now they're older. But I know that if any one of us gets the coronavirus, the hospitals would not let us in and we will die outside. So there is a real fear that pervades these people who have already lost everything and now they're stuck with this uncertainty of the virus.
Well, thank you, Qudus. I think this is obviously an eye-opening account. And I think that when you see advocates working in this space and when you actually hear the stories of refugees during this time, there's just, it's a crippled legal process. I mean, just the practicality, right, of processing UNHCR cases right now. Things like availability of experts. There's a very important expert on the persecution of Christians in Pakistan who we've been working with on a case. And he was telling us about just his own organization's difficulties during this time and just getting an expert declaration or getting the expert testimony we need. So this is the reality of this pandemic. It's affecting every aspect of refugee advocacy and human rights advocacy, actually. So it's really terrific to hear from a few people who are working on the ground. We have some minutes here, and I wanted to open up to questions. You're welcome to ask a few. I see some on the chat, and we'll call on a few people. You can raise your hand using the More feature below, and we'll hopefully unmute you. But I wanted to begin by asking a question of Ambassador Brownback. Obviously, we have there's a captive audience here of really terrific people. There's a lot of congressional offices represented here on this call, a lot of NGOs. We have terrific organizations, U.S. Institute for Peace, many others who are working in this space, even abroad in Europe as well. It would be helpful to hear from you on what is top mind, from the United States and at this time. I know you've been working very hard to release religious prisoners of conscience, but looking ahead in the coming weeks and months, there's so much uncertainty. What are you prioritizing? What is the U.S. government prioritizing in this space?
Yeah, the big thing really building right now is building the alliance and getting it stood up and action oriented. We've got 29 nations in a religious freedom alliance. We've had our first couple of meetings on it. Secretary Pompeo has been actively engaged, is a strong, staunch supporter of the effort, and it's now really getting it to act. So that's why the religious prisoners issue was a key one during the COVID crisis, that we got a number of the alliance nations to act. We can do things, the United States can push, we do push, but we need a concert. We need an alliance that will act, that will push. And so we're spending a lot of time getting that stood up. We just stood up an informal council of experts that's really a network of networks of religious freedom activists around the world, and had a meeting with them yesterday, and a good group. And then we're really trying to get the grassroots movement going would be the another piece of it. These religious freedom roundtables, that the one that I co-host in Washington, we'd like to see 100 of those started around the world in various places, so that there's a local indigenous advocacy group that's grassroots. It's all the religious communities connected together, standing for each other's religious freedom. Love to see that get going in places like Pakistan. There's one being stood up in Sudan that you heard Johnnie talk about, how much change that they have made, and they have. But to get that on a permanent and ongoing basis, you need an indigenous advocacy group that's of citizens of that nation that are advocating for religious freedom for people there. So it's really at the top level of building the Alliance of Nations, getting these networks of religious freedom advocates on a focused and effective force, and then really getting the thing to go grassroots in these individual nations that needs to happen. You can push from outside, but most of the time you really need advocacy in that country. You need the people there to take it and own it, of we want religious freedom for us.
Ambassador, really helpful to know that, because I think a lot of advocates want to know how they can help. And one of the aspects to these crises that we've seen, at least I've observed, a few of the questions on the chat also kind of pertain to this, which is we've seen citizenship rights being denied so communities that are thriving in their countries. Some people might not know, but they're Rohingya members of parliament, for instance, years ago, So they're in the case of Ahmadis, the first foreign minister of Pakistan was an Ahmadi, and there have been situations where their rights were protected, and then the rights were forcibly stripped. It's happened in the Uyghur context as well, and then that creates the indicia or the groundswell for aspects of crimes against humanity and potential genocide. So can you comment a bit about this? I don't want to say it's a new phenomenon, but it's an increasing phenomenon of citizenship rights, civil rights being denied in these foreign governments, and that is a gateway to further atrocities?
Yeah, and it is a gateway to further atrocities. It's once you start down that road, there's no logical stopping point other than the desire to just kick them out of the country altogether and commit a crime against humanity or a genocide. And the thing that's so short-sighted by governments is you're throwing away your most valuable resource, which is your own people, that if you'll spend some time developing and working with, will cause thriving in your own nation. And just because they have a different religious view is actually an asset. This will help broaden the thought. This will help open up really for more human rights for the rest of the people, which will grow your economy and will stabilize your nation. And that's what's so tragic about it in so many places. And unfortunately, we're seeing this phenomena grow. You see in China right now, China's just at war with faith. The concept of people organizing around a faith has taken on this new urgency by the Communist Party to thwart. And so they take on the Uyghurs and put 1 million in detention concentration camps. They cultural genocide against the Tibetan Buddhists, the Falun Gong. They've persecuted, and these charges of organ harvesting that still the Chinese could answer if they would just have an open and transparent system, and don't. So you've got these credible charges of forced organ harvesting taking place, and then the house church that's constantly persecuted there. My point being this is a bad long-term strategy for a nation, and yet we're seeing it increasingly. But countries that are starting to turn the corner and say, no, we want to grow, they're embracing their religious minority communities and saying, no, this is a strength and we need to have it.
Yeah, and a few questions have come in the chat, and I'm also getting some WhatsApp messages for questions. On that point, Ambassador, I know it's obviously you're focused on religious freedom, and this is, I guess, a legal determination, but what is your view of how to go about designating something as a genocide? You know, some people really push for that designation, and upon that designation, I know a lot goes into that. Is that something that you consider or your team considers?
Well, that's not in our call to make. That's for the secretary to make that call, and there's a legal process that goes into it. It is a factual basis that is set by law for what goes into a genocide determination. Genocide determinations are very serious matters. I think the last one we did was that the State Department did was under Secretary Kerry for Northern Iraq.
Correct.
And what was taking place there to the Yazidis and the Christian communities, which was horrific and was a genocide. But other groups have different legal standards that they use for genocide. It's a very, very important one. I carried the bill in the Congress to declare Darfur a genocide when it was going on, and it was. I urge people, if the factual basis is there, build the case, put it in, get it into members of Congress to advocate for these matters and for genocide determinations, because it's a very powerful tool. And one of the good things that's happening is we used to only declare genocides as we saw them in the past, and we said what happened to Jews in World War II was a genocide. Now we're much more in the process of doing it while it's going on, which is a more helpful thing, because maybe you can help stop it or stop some of the fallout from it.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. There are a number of questions coming on a variety of case studies, and obviously we're now hitting the hour mark. So we'll go on just for a couple more minutes, just so we can get a few more questions in. And feel free to post them online, or you can message, or you can even raise your hand if you want. It dawned on me, Reverend Moore, as you were giving your report, that there is this groundswell movement of folks who really want to have true international religious freedom for all, and that we just see that there's such an increase of hostility, and there are some who criticize or will be critical of international religious freedom commissions, even USER, for instance, or the viability of continuing this work because it's necessarily prioritizing international religious freedom versus other fundamental rights in the Constitution. And we know that religious freedom is the first freedom. So how would you react to those who, and I'm sure you've dealt with folks like that, who have that level of critique?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, and I think my commissioner colleagues would agree with me, that in most circumstances around the world, when you have religious freedom in place, you will see all of the other human rights in place. It isn't always the case that if you have the other human rights in place, that you have religious freedom in place, right? And so, I think there's sort of considerable precedent that when we say this is a first freedom, that it actually is a foundational freedom. The other thing I would say, and this is a general bias of mine, and perhaps it reflects my personal opinion, but I just think there's too little religion in foreign policy and in policy making, period. We're an incredibly religious world. And as an advocate for religious freedom, it is also important to say that I'm not just advocating for the freedom of the practice of religion, I'm advocating for the freedom of belief, which means that you have the right to not practice any religion at all. But you'd be hard-pressed around the world to find a country that doesn't have more prosperity, a more stable government, better rule of law, and human rights across the board if they have religious freedom. And I should also say, that these other fundamental freedoms, where they don't exist, there are other consequences. We all know that. But just reflecting back on we'll leave it to others later on to determine what exactly happened in China and the WHO with COVID-19 and all of that. That's not for us to decide here. But one of the things that is clear here is that there are several very prominent figures in China who have vanished, including doctors and a business tycoon who've just gone away, that were opposing the government. And so what I often find is that the general health of a society is tied to these things, and you will always find advocates for religious freedom advocating for all those other human rights. I'm sad to say that sometimes you don't find advocates for those other human rights always advocating for religious freedom, and we all need to be in this together. We should be the freedom of the press. Journalists are persecuted in the same way that religious people are persecuted around the world. And I just add one more point, Amjad, to what Ambassador Brownback was saying about genocide. I just want to remind everyone that when Secretary Kerry made his declaration of genocide, and I was very intimately involved in all of that, a lot of us were, which was a frequent. In the end, he said, in my personal estimation, it is, right? There was a lot of opposition. It was a very difficult decision to make. But what he had going for him in making that decision is he had unanimously passed legislation from Congress, right? And I think sometimes we rely on the executive branch to do something where we ought to be, there is no more profound statement for a country to make when it comes to human rights and declaring genocide. And these things often begin on the legislative side, as the ambassador did with Darfur, awakening the conscience of the world to Darfur because one legislator decided to be an advocate for his constituents and rallied the whole group to his cause.
And piggybacking off of those comments, both Ambassador Brownback and Reverend Moore's comments just now about particular communities, religious communities have this ability. The beleaguered religious communities are often some of the best advocates and provide so much richness and intellectual contributions to those countries. One of the sad realities in talking to my Uyghur colleagues and advocates, and some who are on this call, is seeing so many poets, so many physicists, so many incredibly talented people who have disappeared. And we're talking about hundreds of intellectually vibrant contributors to society, professors at various universities, who because of their faith cannot actually give that gift of education to others. This has happened with the Ahmadiyya community. It's an amazing quick point that I want to raise, which some people might not know, but the first Nobel laureate in Pakistan before Malala was Abdus Salam. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics. He was a member of the Ahmadiyya community. And if you go to his tombstone, the epitaph, his epitaph, the word Muslim is erased from that tombstone. Here lies the first Muslim Nobel laureate, it says. But the word Muslim has been taken away because it's an arrestable offense and the body can be exhumed. And he was someone who had to leave Pakistan, even though he set up so much intellectual infrastructure in Pakistan. And what he did, amazing story that I learned recently, he actually, and this was at an early time, you know, as he was being persecuted in the 70s and moving forward, was he set up a scholarship for Uyghurs in China, because he visited China and he met with Uyghur physicists, and he sponsored 2 Uyghurs to come to Trieste, Italy, to be physicists. So you're talking about 2 communities, Ahmadis and Uyghurs, who are among the most sorely persecuted communities, yet intellectually they're working with each other to rescue this intellectual impulse and current in these communities and to find sojourn for that. It reminds me of the Jewish scientists who were rescued in the Rockefeller Center here in America. It reminds me of these incredible people who escaped Nazi Germany, but now their generations are serving all of humanity. So in a way, this protecting religious freedom is also protecting societies and their advancement in education as well. So I thought I'd share that. We are reaching the limit here. I don't want to keep anyone too long. I do want to give an opportunity for any of the panelists to say a few final words. If there's any further questions, I encourage you to let us know. We can certainly, International Religious Freedom Roundtables are every week, and you can certainly, I think Ambassador Brownback is one of the most accessible people I've met, and I know he's going to be able and willing to answer questions, and his team, which is an extraordinary team that work very hard, some of whom are on this call. I just wanted to give a chance to any of the panelists to say a few words before we wrap up here.
I just encourage everyone to go to usurf.gov, get the report, download the report, educate yourself, and then talk about it to people. That makes all the difference in the world.
Thank you.
I'd just like to just briefly pick up on that thread of a genocide determination. The Rohingya community, I think, would benefit tremendously from a genocide determination. Our friends at Refugees International just today released a report encouraging the State Department to make a genocide determination with respect to the situation the Rohingya are facing. But it would certainly breathe a lot of life into efforts to achieve accountability for atrocities, and that could certainly have a preventative effect. And it would send a very clear message to those who are enjoying impunity right now. So I appreciate that bit of the discussion, and thank you once again, everybody, for the opportunity to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your time. You've been very generous with your time. I think I see one hand up. It's Azhar. I'll unmute your line if you want to ask your question. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I'm Azhar. I'm from the APPG for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the UK. Thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Just one quick question to Reverend Johnnie Moore. You mentioned the IRFA legislation, which is quite interesting, and I definitely would look forward to reading it. Do you have any examples in the past where the US government has done that successfully with other countries?
Yeah, the ambassador could speak to it better than I can, but Uzbekistan, I think, is a very, very good example. I'm not sure. I don't know whether or not the U.S. government has used the actual tool in the IRFA legislation, but what they've done and what we've been an eyewitness to as sort of an independent watchdog is that they've sat down with the leaders of the country and they've gotten a plan. The country recognized they had a problem. They were ready to solve the problem. The United States government was willing to recognize that this is a complex problem in certain circumstances, and complex for good reasons and for bad reasons sometimes. But there was actually a plan. And again, what I said earlier, if the Sudan can change, okay, and there've been plenty of other examples. And we are actually, there are plenty of bad things to talk about around the world. We list a lot of them in the report. There are a lot of good things as well. We have never seen so much momentum on this issue as we see now. So yeah, I think there are several specific examples.
Ambassador?
Yeah, I agree. I think those are the ones we've been working very closely with Uzbekistan since I've been in office. And here's a nation that wants to change. And then they've got a debate within their own country, kind of usually between the more liberalized forces and the security forces. But we keep pushing and working with them. Sudan is really in the midst of momentous change. And then the COVID crisis has hit, and that's going to really make things just even more difficult for them to grow things economically. And then I want to back up one point just because the nature of the call. We really do need these grassroots movements to take root in other places and other countries. And so if you're one that can help organize one of these or know some religious leaders that could do it in some of these nations that need to have more religious freedom and would be good for them, I hope you'll take the time to get those moving forward. Greg Mitchell heads the one up here. He's accessible. Our office can help, but there's just really no substitute for civil society, religious societies to be engaged in pushing for these rights, these fundamental rights to be experienced by your own people in that nation.
Thank you very much. A very good note to end on, Ambassador. We thank you so much for your generous time. We thank everyone during these trying times. Our thoughts and prayers are with everyone and your loved ones. Thank you for joining. We'll have some future programming. We'll try to dig deeper into some of these issues on the legalities and so forth, so look for that. Thank you so much for spending your part of your day. For now, we'll adjourn this session.